As you can see, I already created new project and named it week 7 because this is officially our week 7. So the task is the first order of business is to overview assignment 4, which is generally speaking focusing on using functions in our code. So let's resize this and specifically, this homework assignment is focusing on something that's called serial date. Serial date is a date that essentially representing a date in our calendar, but it's represented by a single integer. So basically, we need to design a program and write a program that asks for month, day, and year, asks the user to enter this month, day, and year, and after entering month, day, and year, it calculates a serial date. So serial date is a sequence of incremented by 1 integers that represent calendar days. The power of serial date is it's very easy to compare dates, to do computations with them. For instance, you can take today's date and quickly add number of days to it and be able to do computations, or take two calendar days, compute serial dates, and decide which one is in the past, which one is in the future, because you can very easily compare integers. So again, for this July 4th, 1776, the serial date would look like this. And that's the idea behind the serial date, that every calendar day can be represented by an integer. So this is the math. First part of this assignment is asking us to actually compute the serial date. Just be aware that every single function and every single part of this assignment is focusing on integer arithmetic. So integer arithmetic means that every single variable here is plain integer. We ask the user for month, for the day, for the year, and these are just integer numbers, and that's what we're going to ask user to input. Once they input it, we can use these formulas to do our computation, and this result and date is actually, if we properly construct all these formulas, this is going to give us the resulting serial date. So what's involved? So once again, we need to write this function that looks like, its name is enter serial Julian date, and then we ask user for 3 integers, and this is the implementation of the function. And with integer arithmetic, operator precedence is very important. So let me give you an example. In fact, in preparation for the solution, I would definitely not hesitate to say, I already created my main file in my new project for this week, but I would not hesitate to just simply add new item to our source files, and this will be our another C++ file, which I will call serial date.cpp, and create that. So you can see it gets opened, and of course, because I'm going to be implementing multiple functions, I know that I need to declare them in a header file. So my first line here will include serial date.h, right? So this is the header file which I would like to include. Of course, I don't have the serial date, but I have my a project already created, and I have my subfolder where I keep my source files. So right side by side with the main.cpp and the serial date CPP. Oh, by the way, I need to rename this file. I actually misspelled its name by not removing extra extension. So I'll just go here to list of source files, and right here there's an option to rename it, and I'll just get rid of this extra CPP suffix in its name. So the file gets renamed right here, and now directly in my file manager I can right click and say create new text document, and then rename it as, sorry, I clicked the wrong button, rename. Okay, rename, and this will be serial date.h. Get rid of the text extension. Of course, you need to be able to display file extensions, otherwise you will not be able to properly rename it. But you see that I'm creating empty text file and renaming it as serial date.h. And now I can just simply drag and drop this into my Visual Studio environment, and here of course the first order of business is to create a header guard, right? So we need to create the header guard because every header file needs a header guard. So that's step number one. I typically start with right clicking here on the tab, and you can say copy full path and just simply paste this in as a comment. But normally I don't need to keep the entire comment in the file. Rather, I would just store the name of the file like this, and then use this name of the file by copying its name to say if not defined, something like that, and replace the dot with an underscore. And if you double click on a name like this, you can press Shift Control U and convert it to uppercase. And we take this line and copy it and say if it's not defined, then define it, right? So this will be creation of our header guard macro, and this if not defined requires an if directive for the preprocessor. You can even comment this here as well. So the purpose of this and if is to close the serial date H included header guard, right? So now everything that I would like to include in this file is going, or will be writing in this file will be placed inside these header guards. So I have now what? I have now serial date.cpp, which is implementation file, and this CPP file is now on the list of source files. Recall that the header file should not be placed on this list of source files, otherwise you're going to get strange errors. So now back to the assignment, and it says, so why don't you have such function? And you see that this looks exactly like a function declaration. So function declarations belong to the header file. So I copy it from here, click on my header file, and paste this declaration inside the header file. Very nice. Then I will immediately duplicate this inside the implementation file. Right, and this time I will close my Solution Explorer and just to make everything visible, and here replace the semicolon, which is the requirement of the function declaration, and replace it with the normal function body like this, and this is our serial Julian date closing brace. So once we start typing inside, we can see that this is our serial Julian date function. Here we can write its implementation, but at least to be able to compile it, we can just return 0, right? Because we don't have an implementation, but we can have an empty function which takes 3 integers, does some computation, and returns the integer back, right? So now in our main file, right, so once again, directly out of this homework assignment, which is here, right, we copied the declaration of our function, and basically right now this needs to be replaced by computation of end date. And consider that these variables a, m, y, and so forth are just integers, right? So if in the math textbook it says a equals 14 minus month divided by 12, then here this needs to look like int a equals 14 minus month, right, divided by 12. But in integer arithmetic, operator precedence is extremely important, and therefore we need to be able to parenthesize it, otherwise it will be incorrect computation. So this is an example of implementation of this formula, a equals 14 minus month divided by 12. If you ask me what are these formulas and what they represent, I will tell you honestly that I don't know any details. There is a link to the calendar website that explains in greater detail all these computations and the logic behind them. In our case, we just need to adopt these formulas and be able to do the correct computations. So for the next line, I would just copy exactly as it goes right here, right? So we say int m equals, don't reinvent new names, we just use exactly what is being given us as a set of formulas to use. M equals month, plus 12a. Of course, in the textbook this is multiplication. We have to explicitly say 12 multiplied by a minus 3. So just be careful not to mistype parts of the formulas, and make sure that you keep them in correct order. And in the longest formula over here, where it says end date equals, of course we will be declaring again, so this, more computation, and eventually we'll say int end date equals, and we provide the formula over here, right? And eventually all we need to do is just return this end date, and so we're done. But in formula like this, it says day plus, and then you see the fraction. Just make sure that on top of the fraction, right, in the numerator of the fraction, it says 153 times m plus 2. We'll make sure that this numerator has to be parenthesized, right? Just to give you a quick example, so it says day plus 153, make sure that you spell everything correctly, multiplied by m plus 2. Okay, so somebody who understands math came up with these formulas. We as programmers just have to follow their direction. So this needs to be parenthesized, and then you see it says divided by 5. So right here, we're just going to say divided by 5. Okay, and it says plus, and there is more and more and more math that needs to be implemented. But this is an example where you take this fraction, and this is exactly how you need to interpret it. You just say, okay, whatever's on top of the fraction, it's numerator, right? And this is the not denominator, right? So we divide it by 5 like this, but this must be parenthesized, otherwise it will not do the right work because of the operator precedence rules. Division has higher precedence than plus, for example, and we need to be able to do everything correctly. So this is an example of doing this type of work. And so once we have the function in our main program, right, in our main program, we just go here and we say int main, and now we ask the user for the inputs, and essentially we need to declare. Again, I would not reinvent different variable names. We'll already use variable names for month, day, and year. So therefore, you just declare them as they are given to us. It's just declare them like this would work just fine. Right? Just declare the variables and then ask the user to provide. Right. So now we have to. Prompt for month, day, and year like this. Then obviously we'll populate these variables, and then we need to convert to serial date, like basically saying int we can name it serial date over here. Serial date equals this function call, right? We already created this function, and we can now use this brand new function to convert month, day, and year into serial date, and we can now display serial date if we want to. Display serial date by, I am assuming, using std cout and somehow, showing the serial date with all of the bells and whistles and comments and so forth. Right? To complete this segment, of course, we need to, let's just say return 0 over here, but of course, definitely we must include our serial date.h header file that we now created, that now can be shared by all source files in our program. So now this function instantly becomes available. We can use it for computations, right? Remember, this is what we call function definition, and this is what we call function declaration. In our header file, this is our function declaration. Of course, it all looks good. It has all the elements declared properly. This is our function declaration, our function prototype, and we include it in both serial Julian date, in the source file that implements the functions, and also inside the main file. I would also recommend that if you're using standard library headers, for instance, include IOStream, make sure that you keep your standard library headers on top of your own headers. So it's a very common practice to use our custom headers, the headers that we create part of our application development, and we specify them after listing all the system header files, right? So that's the approach here.